Welcome to Sinister Serials, where shadows whisper and every tale chills to the bone.
Beneath the veneer of suburban tranquility, shadows whisper tales of intrigue and deception. In Rosewood Falls, every rose has its thorn, and every secret garden hides a darker truth. Betty Monroe, a woman of intellect and ambition, finds herself ensnared in a web much larger than her own desires. The garden circle, a facade of community benevolence, masking the machinations of power and control. Doris Fletcher, caught in the storm of change, dares to question the foundations of her seemingly idyllic life. As the veil lifts, friendships fray, alliances are tested, and the heart of Rosewood Falls is laid bare. Join us on Twisted Tuesdays, where Suburban Secrets unfolds the eerie tales lurking behind closed doors and manicured lawns.
Chapter 16. Doris's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing the words flung at her husband minutes earlier. Shame and betrayal swirled within her like a poisonous cocktail. She stood in the hallway outside their bedroom, the harsh overhead lighting casting unsettling shadows on the stairway landing. The scent of her perfume, usually so comforting, was now tainted with the memory of his lies. Each tick of the bedside clock resonating from the bedroom felt like a blow to her sanity. The floral pattern on the wallpaper, once so serene, now mocked her naivete. Doris craved solitude to process her shattered emotions, yet a part of her hoped that George would somehow make things right. The soft creak of floorboards in the stairway signaled George's approach. His voice was hesitant, his tone practiced and apologetic, yet lacking genuine remorse.
Doris, please, let's just talk.
Every hollow apology chipped away at Doris's resolve, rekindling her anger. She fought the urge to lash out, desperate to retain some semblance of control. A flicker of hope that he might truly understand the pain he'd caused was swiftly extinguished, leaving Doris colder than before. Doris turned, her gaze searing through George, her voice low and venomous, cut through his practiced speech.
Talk? You want to talk now? After all the lies and deceit? Your actions spoke louder than words ever could, George.
She unleashed the full force of her hurt, every accusation precise and calculated.
How long have you been seeing her? How long have you been making a fool out of me?
With each word, Doris reclaimed her power. She chose to no longer be the victim, to make him face the consequences of his betrayal. She stood defiant, unyielding. George's face contorted with unease.
Doris, you're overreacting. It was just a mistake. A one-time thing. It meant nothing.
Frustrated by her defiance, George grew bolder, closing the distance between them. He reached out, an attempt to either silence or comfort. Doris couldn't decipher which.
Doris, don't do this. We can work through this, just like we always have. Let's go to bed and talk about it in the morning.
Survival instincts kicked in. Doris, fueled by fear and revulsion, reacted viscerally. She shoved him, a purely instinctive act to protect herself.
Don't touch me. You lost that right the moment you betrayed our marriage.
George stumbled, his eyes widening in shock. It was a split second of suspended time before the inevitable began. A flicker of horror washed over Doris's face as George's body pitched backward, his arms flailing uselessly. She followed his fall with her eyes, the world tilting on its axis as he vanished from sight. A thud echoed from downstairs. Fury dissipated, replaced by a bone-chilling fear. In the space of a heartbeat, her world had irrevocably changed. Doris stood frozen in horror as George's body pitched backwards, his arms flailing desperately for purchase. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, each second stretching out into an eternity as he tumbled head over heels. George's panicked screams ripped through the air, a terrifying soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. His hands grasped at the air, seeking any handhold to stop his descent, but he found only empty space. Doris watched in mute horror, her mind struggling to process the reality of what was happening. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare, a terrible dream from which she would soon awaken. George's body hit the stairs with a sickening thud, his limbs twisting and contorting as he tumbled downwards. The sound of bones striking wood echoed through the house, a macabre percussion that made Doris's stomach lurch. She wanted to look away, to close her eyes and block out the horrific sight before her. But she found herself transfixed, unable to tear her gaze from the unfolding tragedy. George's screams took on a wet, gurgling quality as he neared the bottom of the stairs, his body slamming against the ornate finials with a devastating crunch. And then silence. A terrible, deafening silence that seemed to swallow the world whole. For a moment, Doris stood frozen, her mind reeling from the shock of what had just transpired. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, she lurched into action, stumbling down the stairs on trembling legs. She had to help him, had to do something. Even after everything that had happened, even after the betrayal and the lies, she couldn't just leave him there, broken and bleeding on the cold, hard floor. As Doris knelt beside George's lifeless form, the true extent of his injuries became horrifyingly clear. Blood pooled beneath his head, a macabre halo that seemed to mock the sanctity of their home. His skull was dented, a sickening indentation that spoke of the force of his impact, her hands hovering uncertainly over his body. She was afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. With shaking fingers, Doris reached out and pressed them against George's neck, searching for a pulse. His skin was still warm, but there was no reassuring throb beneath her fingertips. She pressed harder, willing there to be a sign of life, but there was nothing. Panic clawed at her throat as the reality of the situation sank in. George was dead, and she was responsible. Her actions, her anger, had led to this moment, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Doris's mind raced as she tried to process the enormity of what had happened. She had to do something, had to make a decision. Should she call for help, risking exposure and the possibility of being blamed for George's death? Or should she try to cover it up, to distance herself from the tragedy and hope that no one would ever discover the truth? Doris sat back on her heels, her gaze fixed on George's lifeless form. The adrenaline that had fueled her earlier rage had dissipated, leaving her feeling hollow and numb. She knew that her life had changed forever, that there was no going back to the way things had been before. The choices she made in the next few moments would determine the course of her future, for better or for worse. As Doris struggled to come to terms with the horror of what had happened, a flicker of movement outside the front window caught her attention. A figure was approaching the house, their silhouette distorted by the sheer curtains. Doris's heart seized in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Was it a neighbor drawn by the commotion? A witness to the tragedy that had just unfolded? Or perhaps something more sinister, a threat lurking in the shadows? Doris stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the relentless knocking echoed through the hallway. Each sharp rap against the wood felt like a blow to her already frayed nerves, denying her the luxury of a moment's respite to process the horrific events that had just transpired. Fear paralyzed her, rooting her feet to the floor, even as her mind screamed at her to move, to act. But beneath the terror, a primal instinct for self-preservation stirred, propelling her towards the door with halting, unsteady steps. Doris's thoughts raced, a chaotic whirlwind of possibilities and consequences. Should she answer the door and risk exposing the terrible truth of what had happened? Or should she hide, praying that whoever was on the other side would eventually give up and go away? The knocking grew louder, more insistent, each blow reverberating through Doris's skull like a jackhammer. Her mind conjured a parade of nightmarish scenarios. A concerned neighbor drawn by the commotion, the police responding to reports of a disturbance, or someone far more sinister, connected to the dark secrets that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect suburban life. Each unanswered knock felt like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds until her fate was sealed. Doris knew that she had to make a decision, and quickly. To answer the door was to risk discovery, but to ignore it could lead to an even worse outcome: forced entry and the shattering of the fragile illusion she was desperately trying to maintain. Panic gave way to a cold calculation as Doris considered her options. If she answered the door, could she convincingly play the shocked and grieving wife, blindsided by the sudden tragedy? Or would her guilt be written all over her face, betraying her to whoever stood on the other side? But if she chose to hide, to pretend no one was home, what then? The thought of the door being forced open, of George's broken body being discovered by prying eyes, sent a shudder of dread through her. In a split second, Doris made her choice. The fear of the unknown outweighed the immediate consequences. She would answer, gambling on her ability to maintain a facade. It was a risk with potentially devastating repercussions. As Doris tried to work out her plan, her mind raced, frantically constructing a believable story. Each thought felt impossible, as if she were hurtling towards her own demise. The knocking stopped for a brief, heart-stopping moment. Then, the sound of the doorknob turning shattered the silence. Doris's heart plummeted, utter panic seizing her chest. She had no idea who waited for her on the other side, potential salvation or a further plunge into a meticulously crafted facade. A flicker of defiance ignited within Doris as the door began to swing open. Regardless of who stood on the other side, she refused to crumble. She had become the architect of her own fate, for better or worse. The door started to swing open, revealing the face of her unexpected visitor. In that moment, Doris felt a jolt of recognition, though she couldn't quite place it. A figure draped in shadows stepped inside, their eyes immediately drawn to George's lifeless form. Doris stood her ground, ready to face whatever came next. The adrenaline-fueled panic gave way to a cold, calculating focus. She embraced the shift, driven by an all-consuming need for self-preservation. As the shadowy figure finally traversed the threshold, the intruder's face coming into the light. Evelyn? What was she doing here? Why was she here? Doris knew that the next few moments would be critical. Her words, her actions, her ability to spin a convincing tale would determine her fate. The game had changed, and she was now playing for keeps. Doris stared at Evelyn, her mind struggling to process the woman's sudden appearance. Of all the people she had imagined on the other side of the door, Evelyn had not been one of them. The leader of the garden circle exuded an aura of calm control, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed Doris's world.
Evelyn, what are you doing here?
Doris's voice wavered, her confusion and fear bleeding into each word. Evelyn stepped further into the foyer, her eyes sweeping over the scene before her.
I knew you needed help, someone to guide you through this darkness, Doris. I came as soon as I could.
Doris's brow furrowed, her mind grappling with Evelyn's cryptic statement. How could she have possibly known? The tragedy had only just occurred, and Doris had not breathed a word of it to anyone. As if sensing her unspoken question, Evelyn moved closer, her gaze drifting to George's lifeless body.
The garden circle has ways of knowing when one of our own is in need, my dear.
The words sent a chill down Doris's spine, a reminder of the power and influence that Evelyn and her society wielded. She had always known that the garden circle held secrets, but the depth of their reach was only now beginning to dawn on her. Doris's instincts screamed at her to be cautious, to guard her words and actions around this enigmatic woman. And yet, a part of her yearned for comfort, for someone to share the burden of the horrific events that had transpired.
I don't understand.
Doris whispered, her voice trembling.
How could you have known? I haven't told anyone.
Evelyn placed a hand on Doris's shoulder, her touch gentle yet firm.
There's no need to fear, Doris. I'm here to help you. The garden circle takes care of its own.
Doris flinched at Evelyn's touch, her mind reeling with the implications of her words. The garden circle's reach seemed to extend far beyond the manicured lawns and polite society of their suburban community. The thought was both comforting and terrifying.
This doesn't make any sense.
Doris murmured, her gaze locked on Evelyn's face, searching for answers.
How did you know this was going to happen?
Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of the front door bursting open shattered the moment. Doris whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat at the sight of Betty Monroe standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. In that instant, Doris realized that her world had just collided with Betty's, their stories merging in a way she could never have anticipated. The arrival of her neighbor added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation, and Doris felt a sense of dread settle in the pit of her stomach. As Betty's gaze darted from George's body to Evelyn's presence, Doris knew that the truth of the garden circle's power and influence was about to be laid bare. The secrets that had long lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect suburban existence were unraveling, and Doris found herself at the center of the storm.
Chapter 17. Betty's mind raced as she sped through the night, her heart pounding in her chest. The confrontation with Evelyn played on a loop in her head, each chilling word echoing in the silence of the car. She longed for the comfort of her old life, for the blissful ignorance that had once been her shelter from the storm. Fear and determination warred within her, a constant battle that left her feeling drained and uncertain. The ancient evil that Evelyn had spoken of, the dark rituals and forgotten epochs, filled her with a terror she had never known. And yet, a stubborn spark of defiance refused to let her give in, urging her to keep fighting, to find a way to stop the circle before it was too late. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. Each bump in the road sent a jolt through her body, a physical manifestation of the unease that gripped her soul. As Betty drove, her mind lost in the labyrinth of her own thoughts, she almost missed the sight of Doris's house passing by her window. But something caught her eye, something that made her blood run cold. There, standing at Doris's front door, was Evelyn. The same Evelyn who just minutes before had been at her manor on the other side of town, revealing the shocking truth about the garden circle. Betty's foot slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt at the side of the road. Her mind reeled with the impossibility of what she was seeing. How could Evelyn be here, at Doris's house, when she had just left her at the manor? It defied all logic, all reason. Betty sat in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced with the implications of Evelyn's impossible appearance at Doris's house.
"This can't be happening,"
she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with fear and confusion.
"How is she here? How is this possible?"
But even as the questions tumbled from her lips, a sickening realization began to dawn on her. The garden circle, with its dark rituals and ancient pacts, wielded a power that defied the laws of nature. Evelyn's presence here, so soon after their confrontation, was a testament to that power. Betty's instincts screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance between herself and Evelyn as possible. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to uncover the truth in the first place, urged her to stay, to find out what Evelyn was doing at Doris's house. With a deep breath, Betty made her decision. She cut the engine, plunging herself into darkness, and watched as Evelyn knocked on Doris's front door. As Betty watched, her heart pounding in her chest, the door to Doris's house opened. Doris stood there, her face a mask of confusion and fear as she stared at Evelyn. Betty strained to hear their conversation, but the distance and the hum of the night made it impossible. She could only watch as Evelyn stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a finality that sent a chill down Betty's spine. Her mind raced with the possibilities of what could be happening inside. Was Evelyn there to threaten Doris, to ensure her silence? Or was there something more sinister at play, some dark purpose that Betty had yet to uncover? She knew that she couldn't just sit there, watching from the shadows. She had to do something, to find out what Evelyn was doing and how it fit into the larger puzzle of the garden circle's activities. But even as she reached for the car door, ready to confront the danger head-on, a flicker of doubt crept in. What if she was walking into a trap? What if her presence only made things worse for Doris? Betty sat back in her seat, her mind reeling with the weight of her discovery. Evelyn's impossible appearance at Doris's house had shattered any illusions she might have had about the nature of the forces she was dealing with. The garden circle wielded a power that defied explanation, a power that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality to its will. And Evelyn, with her cryptic words and inhuman eyes, was at the center of it all. Betty sat in her car, her heart racing, as she watched Doris's house from a distance. The gentle chirp of crickets seemed at odds with the building tension within her, and the smell of damp grass and a distant barking dog anchored her in the otherwise surreal moment. Her mind raced, trying to determine the best course of action. She feared what she might discover, but she also recognized that this could be crucial for her investigation. The need to understand why Evelyn was at Doris's house consumed her, but a sense of self-preservation urged her to leave before she was discovered. Summoning her courage, Betty inched her car closer, parking in a shadowy spot that offered a partial view of Doris's front porch. She strained her ears, trying to make out the conversation between Doris and Evelyn, but the distance made it difficult to hear clearly. The tone of their voices was urgent and tinged with a hint of desperation, but Betty couldn't make out the exact words. The fear of being caught fueled her anxiety, but a flicker of defiance surged through her. She needed more proof, solid evidence to break through the circle's web of deception. With a deep breath, Betty carefully exited the car, her heart pounding. She moved stealthily across the street, trying to find a better vantage point while remaining hidden. The decision to get closer was a calculated gamble, but one she felt compelled to take. As she crept closer, snippets of the conversation became clearer, raising more questions than answers. Betty heard Doris's frantic question,
How did you know this was going to happen?
The tension skyrocketed as Betty desperately tried to piece together the context of this exchange. Evelyn's response, though incomplete, hinted at her involvement in something unsettling, further cementing the idea that she possessed dangerous power. Betty's mind raced with the implications of what she was hearing. What had happened inside Doris's house? And how was Evelyn connected to it? As Betty stood there, hidden in the shadows, she realized that she would have to risk getting even closer to hear more. But there was a nagging fear that if she was caught, the repercussions could be severe. Doris's question echoed Betty's own doubts, leaving her desperate for answers. The adrenaline rush fueled a cold focus, and Betty knew that the need for tangible evidence outweighed the risk. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The fragmented conversation suggested that something sinister had taken place in Doris's house, implicating Evelyn as the mastermind behind it. Betty knew that she was walking a dangerous line, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth, however frightening, demanded to be uncovered, and she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Creeping closer to Doris's house, her heart pounded in her chest like a caged bird desperate for escape. The dampness of the night air pricked her skin, sending a shiver down her spine, and the rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a whispered warning, urging her to turn back before it was too late. Each step felt impossibly loud, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet echoing in the stillness of the night. But Betty's desire for a clear view of what was happening inside drove her forward, propelling her towards the truth, no matter the cost. Fear battled with a fierce determination within her, a constant push and pull that left her feeling both exhilarated and terrified. She knew the danger she was in, the risks she was taking by coming here, but turning back meant giving up on the truth, on the chance to expose the dark secrets that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect suburban lives. Betty's mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery, to make sense of the fragments of conversation she had overheard. She clung to the hope that whatever she discovered would justify the mounting risks she was taking, that it would be worth the price she might have to pay. As Betty moved closer, she angled herself by the side of the house, pressing her back against the rough brick and trying to steady her breathing. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye, and Betty's gaze snapped to the window, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see shadowy figures moving inside, their silhouettes distorted by the eerie glow of the lamplight. A flicker of recognition jolted through her, a sickening realization that she knew all too well. She shouldn't be seeing any movement in the house, especially not with Evelyn Hart present. The implications of what that might mean sent a chill down her spine, and Betty had to fight the urge to turn and run, to flee back to the safety of her car and drive away, never looking back. But she couldn't do that. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. Betty's vantage point was still limited. She could see enough to understand that something unsettling was happening, but she craved a clearer view of what was unfolding, a glimpse into the heart of the darkness that had taken root in their community. Panic surged through Betty's veins, a tidal wave of fear and adrenaline that threatened to sweep her away. But she clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms, and forced herself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand. With a sudden clarity, Betty realized that she had a choice to make. She could give in to the fear, to the voice of reason that screamed at her to turn back, to abandon this reckless pursuit of the truth. Or she could push forward, risking everything for the chance to expose the dark secrets that had poisoned their lives for far too long. In that moment, Betty made her decision. steely resolve hardened in her chest, a fierce determination that burned brighter than the fear. She would not turn back. Not now, not when she was so close to the answers she sought. Ignoring the voice of reason, Betty abandoned caution and circled closer to the porch, her movements swift and purposeful. This was no longer a stealth mission, no longer a game of cat and mouse. She was done hiding in the shadows, done playing by the rules of a game she never asked to be a part of. With a deep breath, Betty stepped into the pool of light that spilled from the open doorway, her presence suddenly and jarringly known. She heard the sharp intake of breath from inside, the startled gasps of Doris and Evelyn as they whirled to face her.
What have you done?
Betty demanded, her voice ringing out in the stillness of the night, echoing with a strength and conviction she hadn't known she possessed. Betty's sudden appearance shocked the women, their faces a mask of surprise and something darker, more insidious. In the stark silence that followed, her question hung unanswered, a heavy weight that seemed to press down on them all. Betty's eyes darted around the scene, taking in every detail with a growing sense of horror. The overturned furniture, the shattered glass that littered the floor, the dark stains that could only be one thing, blood. And then, with a sickening jolt, Betty saw him. George, lying motionless on the floor, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. In that moment, the horrifying truth hit her full force, a blow that knocked the air from her lungs and sent her staggering back a step. Evelyn's demeanor was chillingly calm, her expression almost bored as she regarded the scene before her. The sight of George's lifeless body seemed to cause her no concern, no flicker of remorse or horror. It was as if she was utterly detached from the tragedy that had unfolded, a mere spectator to the violence and death. And in that moment, Betty knew with a bone-deep certainty that Evelyn was not just a leader, not just a manipulator and a liar. There was something else there, something dark and inhuman that lurked beneath the surface of her carefully crafted facade. Betty stared at George's body in horror, her mind reeling as she struggled to process the scene before her. Evelyn, Doris, the death. It defied belief, defied every rational explanation she could think of. She took a hesitant step forward, moving closer to the open doorway, her eyes still locked on George's lifeless form. The adrenaline that had fueled her earlier boldness was fading now, leaving her feeling hollow and numb. In its place, a cold realization settled over her, a truth that she could no longer deny. She had walked into something far more dangerous and sinister than she ever could have imagined, a web of secrets and lies that threatened to consume them all. As Betty stood there, frozen in the doorway, she knew that there was no turning back now. The truth, however horrifying, demanded to be brought to light, and she would not rest until she had exposed the dark heart of the garden circle, no matter the cost. In the doorway, Betty stood stoic, confronting Doris and Evelyn. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, creating a palpable silence. It was thick with tension and laden with unsaid accusations. Betty knew that the next few words exchanged would be critical, shaping the course of the unfolding tragedy and her own fate. She steeled herself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that the path forward was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But she also knew that she could not turn back, could not abandon the truth that she had fought so hard to uncover. Whatever happened next, Betty was determined to see this through to the end, to bring the secrets of the garden circle into the harsh light of day, no matter the price she might have to pay.
Thank you for joining us on another spine-chilling journey, where nightmares come to life and horror knows no bounds. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're brave enough, step through the door and subscribe to Sinister Serials, where every day brings a new flavor of fear, from macabre Mondays to thriller Thursdays. And don't forget to check out our other terrifying tales, waiting to be discovered in our library of horror. Until next time, keep the lights on if you dare.